This is the 13th annual Guy Caldwell Western Heritage Lecture. Guy Caldwell was a lover of ranching and young people, and he was a lover of education. And one of the things that is certainly true about Guy Caldwell, whose legal first name was Henry, but everyone knew him as Guy, was that he got a lot of those interests from his parents. His dad was Clifton Mott Caldwell, and he usually went by Judge Caldwell because in the course of his career, in the course of his education, he was elected county judge out of his, at that time, hometown of Breckenridge, Texas, which is not far from here. And some of you may be from Breckenridge. So Judge Caldwell, from a very, very early moment in his own life, and I'm talking about very early 20th century, wanted to pursue an education. But he had to quit school and help at the family farm, so he wasn't able to finish his education maybe at the time of life that would have happened. So he dropped out of what you and I would call like secondary school, you know, and helped with his family farm. And then he went back and finished his schooling because he wanted to go to college. And he went on and finished a teaching degree and became a public school teacher. And he moved his family so that they could be a part of public school life. He became the principal at a little school called Caddo School. And then his sort of life's ambition kept coming back up inside of him. And this is Guy Caldwell's father that I'm talking about. He really wanted to study law. And so he worked 2 jobs, and his wife, Corbell Keithley, who was from Breckenridge, she took in boarders at their home with their young children. And they were starting their family. Guy's the oldest. And they began to sort of earn money to pay for C.M. Caldwell to go on to law school at University of Texas in Austin, which he did. And when he finished up, they moved back to Breckenridge because they had a lot of roots in this part of Texas. And they came back to Breckenridge, and they began their family. Eventually, it was time to make a change, and they decided they wanted to be in Abilene. They moved to Abilene. Judge Caldwell was entering into some business deals with a friend of his that began to buy up mineral rights on farmland and began to really be successful in the petroleum business in Texas. He was very blessed. I think he would have told you that. What he really wanted is for his family to go to school. He wanted to see his family educated. And so Guy Caldwell had, from a very young age, instilled in him the importance and the value of education. So his parents, when a school in Abilene called Simmons College wanted to build a whole building for fine arts, they went and talked to Clifton and Corbell Caldwell, and they said, well, I don't know how much you need, but this is how much we can give. And they gave as much as they could give. And as much as they could give paid for every single nail, every single shingle, if you will, for our Caldwell Fine Arts building on this campus. And if you haven't been in there, you need to go and roam around in there. So those are the Caldwells of Caldwell Hall. Guy Caldwell was their dad. Was their son. Guy and Jeanette Caldwell had deep ties to Hardin-Simmons University. Guy graduated in 1927. Jeanette graduated in 1928. They got married right before her graduation certificate was issued, because she finished up her courses, and then she's listed as having graduated in August of 1928. They had 3 children, and very much a generous family, not only to this region and to the state, but to the nation as a whole. And so the children of Guy and Jeanette Caldwell, Clifton and Lee and Molly, wanted to do something in memory of their parents and their grandparents, but particularly their parents and their dad, who loved ranching and loved young people. He came back to Hardin-Simmons often. All of the Caldwells that moved to Abilene were very involved in local community service, church, especially First Baptist Church. They're all on rosters and rolls and Sunday school class attendance sheets for First Baptist Abilene. And they wanted to kind of do something in memory of Guy Caldwell and his love of ranching. When Guy came for his 50th year, 50-year class reunion, that's how we would say that, right? All of the attendees were handed a little piece of paper, kind of like the card that I've given to you tonight. And they were asked to write things about themselves to be recorded for Hardin-Simmons history. And one of the things that Guy put, and this is sort of the memorable thing that he wrote down at the bottom for hobbies, was cow punching. So I don't know how many cow punchers we have in the room tonight, but to him that was a hobby. It was something he did that he loved so much, and that's what he wrote down. When we think about this series, it's been going on since 2006. The first one, I can't help but link this to Bill Wright, because the first lecture that we had was at the Grace Museum, and it was in 2006, and Lee and Ruth and Clifton and Shirley and Molly and some of their adult children came to the Grace to celebrate kicking off that series with us that night. 2 years later, one of Clifton Caldwell's very dear friends, Bill Wright, and his wife Alice opened it was dedicated in honor of Bill and Alice Wright, a very special photography collection that is very important in the state of Texas and continues to be a very prestigious photography collection. And we have the only recently retired curator, photography curator of the Harry Ransom Center at University of Texas Austin with us tonight. He's buried himself further back in the space back there, but Roy Flukinger is here with us, and he has been instrumental in helping Bill and sort of they bounce ideas back and forth off of each other as Bill and so many of the people that he's collaborated with have put so many beautiful works for the world to enjoy. So I just wanted you to have a sense of that name Caldwell. And I wanted you to sort of get to soak that up. And I'm a history professor with a microphone. What do you expect? Bill Wright is with us this evening, and I was kind of joking around with my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, who let me come over and watch Netflix from time to time because I'm too cheap, because I have teenage boys, so that's the issue. But I like to go and over and with my family and watch David Letterman's newer series, My Next Guest Needs No Introduction. And I feel like for a lot of Abilenians, that's the case for Bill. Bill has served education in a number of ways. He's served under President Ronald Reagan. He's worked very closely with the National Endowment for the Humanities. He has served in ways that maybe don't make sense to some of us that don't know much about photography collections, because he has had a hand in making sure that areas where displaying your own photographic work was literally against the law. And Bill has worked as an advocate for photographers to be able to display their work at times when it was not legal to do so. He has given a great deal to the Abilene community. He has, I had a lot of fun reading about, Bill, your tenure as president of the Abilene Fine Arts Museum, which the collection of which ultimately came into the Grace Museum. The year that Bill served as president of Abilene Fine Arts Museum, they received a federal grant that was a matching grant, and it was a golden age, an exciting moment in the history of that organization, from what I've studied. And in a moment of launching Abilene Fine Art Collection to be something that it is today, certainly on the map globally as an important city that loves the arts. And so I thought that was a cool connection to the fact that the Caldwell Lecture was first held in the Grace Museum, that Alice and Bill Wright's photography collection in '08 began at the Grace Museum and continues, and that we get to have Bill here with us tonight to share in this moment. And I want you to just feel that he has a very close relationship with the Caldwell family. So this is extra special to have my friend, an Abilenian, a Texan, someone who inspires me to be a better historian, Bill Wright. If you'll welcome him, please.
I'm going to try and turn this thing on. You know, it certainly brings back memories when you talk about the old Abilene Fine Arts Museum. And I thought you were going to, when you were talking about things that I had done there, I thought you were going to reveal the fact that I gave the first champagne reception for everybody in a dry town. But, you know, I guess that wouldn't be appropriate here.
Tidbits, so it's already off to the races.
But you know, it's true. I love the Caldwell family. They have certainly been great contributors to Hardin-Simmons, but great contributors to the world. And Clifton and Shirley, such dear friends of mine. Clifton passed away, you know, just recently. And I was best man in their wedding, as a matter of fact. And so that family is really, really a wonderful family for Hardin-Simmons and for the community. And thank you for inviting me to share this time with you, and we'll see where it goes. I think we'll have fun.
Well, it means a great deal to our campus to have you here, and you've served behind the scenes in a number of ways, not the least of which on our HSU Board of Trustees. And so thank you for accepting my invitation, and it's good to have you out front and center for a little bit anyway. So our students come from all over the state and all over the nation, and I'm so excited. You know, I've already spotted you. Our students come from all over the world, and it's been a lot of fun to interact with our international students on our campus, especially for me, and I'm excited that you're here. And I told some of my students that you've traveled to their home countries, and that excited them, you know, because they may feel a little homesick in a way that our local students don't. So students often worry about their major, and they worry about if they've picked the right major, if they're going to get a job. And I wondered if you could talk about your own educational journey a little bit this evening to kick us off.
Sure. Well, I think that I wouldn't want anyone to particularly emulate what I have done, because I wasn't really a very good student. But education has really been an important thing for me, and I recognize it because I know that our democracy really depends on an educated population. And I just am anxious to see the public school system as strong as it could be. And right now, compared to other industrial countries, we're not up there where we need to be. And it's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of desire and a lot of other things. But, I can say that to you students who are worried about getting a job, if you do a good job at Hardin-Simmons, you will get a job. That's not a concern. It may not be in your major, but it will be a job, and I think you can relax on that score. But like I say, this is a competitive world, and you got to do the best you can, because you're competing with not only the rest of the United States, but in today's society, you're competing with the world, and that's a pretty big issue. For example, right now there's a movement to try and find an energy source that will fuel this country into the future. We know that oil and gas is a diminishing resource. We know that solar and wind energy are never going to be adequate to take care of the United States. It's a good bridge, and that nuclear is really the only practical answer. And the thing that worries me, for example, is we don't even have a dozen, or maybe more than that, but not many, engineers and scientists working on it. But China has over 1,000 engineers right now working to make safe nuclear energy a reality. And so, we are in a world of competition, and you all are our soldiers in that task. And so it's serious about you doing the best you can and trying to make it go. Now, back to the question about what I think about education. I think that people don't realize you can go to college and get a degree and not be educated. You might be trained, but there's a difference in being trained and being educated. An example, some of you probably are accounting majors expecting to get a CPA, and you will get excellent training at Hardin-Simmons in that field. And most of you will be able to go out and pass the CPA exam and off and running, because it's a very demanding skill. But it doesn't mean you're educated. And by educated, I mean knowing about the world, knowing about literature and art and science and the things that you will encounter as you go through life. And what I would recommend, and it's sort of what I did, is if you have a major in the sciences, take all of your electives in the humanities. If you have a major in the humanities, take all of your elective courses in math and science. And that way you will begin to get a foundation for an educated life. And bear in mind that college is really the training ground for you, because it's going to be a lifetime of learning, if you're lucky.
You said to me recently that in your experience in business, that business is really all about people and being able to talk to people and interact with people. So maybe a wider, casting a wider net in our education and for our students, the degree plans and things, giving them room to do that might create people that can talk about different subjects, or maybe be more prepared to interact with folks around the world in this global society.
Exactly. And if you're worried about a robot, taking your job, and that's going to happen, but there's got to be people to repair them. And, we need to have technicians that are able to do that. There's going to be jobs available. So don't worry about the increasing technology, but just be with it. And but don't forget the humanities, because like you say, in a business situation, it is all about people. And in my own business, that was the thing that I tried to do, was hire the very best people and people that were smarter than me, so that they could do the things that I couldn't do. And it was a good strategy.
So I want to ask you to storytell for us a little bit. Have you ever found yourself in a dangerous or worrisome situation, maybe in pursuit of gathering stories, or getting some photographs, or just exploring places? Something that you would share with our guests tonight?
Well, I've been, in several spots. The first one that stands out in my mind is when my wife and I were in Mexico City, and I was taking street photography, and I was taking pictures with a long telephoto lens. I was sort of sneaking them, we'd be walking down the street, and there'd be a vendor there, with all their goods out and stuff like that, and I'd back off 100 yards or so and sneak a picture, and so we were walking down, and I took the picture of this lady, and she had all this paraphernalia there, and she jumped up and started chasing us, and yelling. I mean, she was really upset, and so I just ducked into a restaurant, and she didn't follow, thankfully. And we just then had a nice casual lunch and everything, and then we got ready to leave, and she was still out the front door. And so we quickly made an exit out of the back. But that made me sort of take stock about taking pictures up close. And I realized I was just nervous about getting up close to someone and taking their picture. You might say I was just scared to do it. And then a friend of mine from Dallas was here one day, and he was telling me about how he overcame that problem. He said that one day he was in Sausalito, California, and he was just walking down the street taking pictures, of the stores and things of that nature, anything that might have caught his attention. And this group of motorcyclists came roaring into town, and they were led by this great big guy with a lot of chains all over him, and tattoos, and he just couldn't stand it. He jumped out in the middle of the street, and he started clicking off those frames, and they just swerved to the curb, and this guy got off his motorcycle and came at him, and he thought to himself, I'm going to strip the film out of this camera, spare my life. And the guy says, we're going in this room here to have a beer, but if you want more pictures when we come out, we'd be happy to oblige. And he said, it opened the door. he realized that people, if you are really interested in them, they're not going to mind you taking their photograph, especially if you will talk with them and engage yourself. And of course, that's the real magic in photography, is not the photograph, it's the process of getting to interact with someone that you don't know and that is different from you or from another country. And so I started shooting with a shorter lens. And I still take an initial photograph normally, and then they may bristle a little bit, then I'll walk up to them and shake their hand and say, I'm Bill Wright from Abilene, and I think you're a really neat guy or woman, and your kids are beautiful, and you've got a nice dog, and and then I always offer to send them a picture, a print, if they are comfortable giving me their address, and I always do it. Interesting story about that. My daughter and I were climbing Kilimanjaro one summer, and we were staying in this hotel in Tanzania, and right outside was this guy with a big display of carved animals and faces and people, carved statues, and ranging from just little things to big ones. And he was busy at work there, and he had his little sign up and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to take his picture, and he said, "Oh no." He said, "I don't want." And I said, he spoke enough English we could communicate, and I said, "I'll send you a photograph." And he thought for a little minute. Then he said, "Okay, but don't be a liar." And I realized that probably dozens of people had photographed him and promised to send a picture, but they never did. And you can be sure I did. In fact, we still communicate. That's been, 20, 30 years ago. Not with him, but with his son, and who has taken up the interchange, So really, it's taking pictures of people, which is what I really like to do. And Roy Flukinger back there in the back is the one that set me onto that course. He said, your landscapes, are nice, but you really need to focus on pictures of people. And one time, I'll tell you one more story. One time we were talking about a little nervous situation. I was in Alice and I were in Puerto Rico, just visited with some friends, and they took us on this little journey out into the mountainside, and taking pictures out of the car window and stuff like that, and I see this guy down there in a little ravine just off of the side of the road, and he has a beef hung up with a rope, and he's skinning it out. I've got to have that. And so they stopped the car. The problem was there was about a 4-foot fence between the road and where I needed to get to photograph him. But I carefully, made my way over the fence, pushed it down, climbed a little bit, got over there, walked about 25 yards down where I could get a picture, and I started taking pictures of him with a little telephoto, and he sees me and he comes for me with a knife, this knife. And, I quickly realized that there's no way I can get back over the fence before he gets to me. So what do? I just had to walk down and face him and say, "My name's Bill Wright from Abilene." and I said, "I've got a friend that's in the same business you are. His name is Robert Gooch, with Gooch Packing Company in Abilene, Texas, and I'm taking this picture to show him how you all do it in Puerto Rico. Well, come on down here." And he said, yeah, and he was very friendly, and we got it done. But the bad part of that story was I get back in the car, and my Puerto Rican friends, they were just, they said, "That guy's stolen that beef. He's, that's a thief that you're talking to down there." But anyway, it worked out.
So let's switch to the idea of history as a discipline, more specifically. So at one time we talked about that we're all contributors to the discipline of history, whether by our production of things that contribute to the historical narrative, or our consumption of items related to the historical narrative. So I wanted you to talk about how we as a society contribute to the narrative, and even to the point of, the thing that the general public can do that the professional historian might not be doing.
Well, that's sort of we've named this little get-together Memoirs of a Grassroots Data Collector. And, that's really how I see myself, is not as a historian. That's a professional job like you all do. Your job is to take data and make sense out of it. And I thought that, I would become the kind of guy that collected the data, And the books that I have written, that's the role I saw for me, is to go out, because I think history is made of little bits and pieces of life, of events that happen, things that occur. And if it's not written down, recorded, photographed, or in some way preserved, it ain't history, And because nobody knows, it's like a tree falling in the desert, if there's not an ear to hear, the philosophers can discuss whether or not it's sound. But so anyway, I want to record and have been recording people's lives, especially in the Big Bend. And that's the reason that I've done several books in the Big Bend. I've photographed them, and then I've asked people to tell me their life story. And it's always fascinating. Everybody's got a story to tell. And so, it might not make sense other than as a nice story in one person's case, but when you take dozens of people, and then you begin to see a matrix of what the society is like, and then a historian comes and says, well, we're writing about life in the Big Bend, or what the life was like at a certain point in time, and you look back in these stories and they tell about how they were able to get by with a windmill and no electricity and things of that nature. And you begin to put together history. And that's the way we produce history a little bit. And, we do it in our own families with our own scrapbooks. If everyone realized how important a scrapbook is to historians, they would be absolutely amazed, and they would take great care with their families' photographs and stories. Because when I was teaching students photography, I would always emphasize to the students to have respect for your work. And by respect, I mean don't just slough it around, you know, take care of it.
They're going to think I told you to say that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, she didn't. Because, you know, and think of it this way, if that scrapbook wound up in a library and a scholar looked at it 100 years from now, you know, do you want it just a sloppy mess, or do you want it to where it showed a professional bit of work, and the information is there with your photographs, so they would know that, you know, the kind of clothing you wore, and the shoes, and the furniture, and the pictures you had on the wall. It all tells about an era of time. And
who was welcome in the room that
exactly.
you were allowed to attend.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you have works that are cataloged in the Smithsonian, and some of that is related to some of your work in the Big Bend area with Native Americans. Is that right? So what drew you to photographing them and researching them and kind of learning more about them and kind of driving you to preserve that visual record?
Well, you know, it was because I was coming back from Kenya, I believe, on this particular trip. And I'd been interviewing people over there, you know, and our guides, our animal guides, I was over there photographing and everything. And I was anxious to know about their life, and we went to a number of Indian or native villages, and you know, the people were wonderful. And I got a lot of that transcribed, and I was thinking about that flying back, and you know, I just thought to myself, you know, here I've been here and there and there, and I have recorded interviews with these people and asked them, but I've never done it with our own indigenous Indian population. And so I said, well, I'm going to do it. And I decided to take the Tigwa tribe because we had a business operation in El Paso, and it was very handy for me to be there. And I was very fortunate that it was that group, because they were primary Spanish speakers. Not they had almost lost the Indian language, and in fact they had a program for Tiwa, which was their language, in their public school deal, where they could send kids to try and bring back the language, you know. And there were a few families that were old and still spoke it, so it was, and they really were doing it for tribal pride, because they were at that time trying to get recognized as a tribe. They were actually intentionally positioning themselves as Hispanic, because the Mexican population wasn't discriminated against as much as the Indian population. So they just passed themselves off, you know, as Hispanics. And but anyway, I knew enough Spanish, I guess, to, you know, find the restroom and order a beer or something, you know. But that's about it. But I didn't know anything about their tribal language, and so I was able to at least get a foothold with the tribe. And I had a person there that introduced me, and I had the confidence of the people, that I was talking to, and that's the reason that book came out. And it documented the tribe all the way from, I guess, the beginning, after the Pueblo Revolt and those times, until just before they got a casino. After they got a casino, the culture of the tribe changed. And so this is mine's the only book that I know of that really documented that more original situation.
So I'm going to see if you have any questions on your cards, and my student leaders are going to take those from you. And so if you wrote down a question, or you want to write down a question, they'll gather them up and get them to us. And you might wave if you have a question card. They'll come around and get that. So we're going to keep talking. So, what is something that you would like for us to think about in regard to the digitization of our photographs, the way we communicate? We put our thoughts out there, not me personally, but people do tweet is a thing I hear. But putting all of our pictures and thoughts in digital formats, as a photographer and a grassroots data collector, does that bother you? And
yeah, it bothers me.
What do you think about that?
It bothers me a lot, because in all reality, we are looking at the possibility of having our time less documented for future generations than the Civil War. Because those original Civil War photographs, they're still very legible and good. But CDs, you can put all of your photographs on a CD, but that's a die and it's gone over a period of time, and especially if you have it on a magnetic tape, they are fragile and they go away in time, I am very concerned that that private conversations are now email, and so you don't get that side of history. And it's a serious problem.
So, with some of our freshmen, we teach the letters that were exchanged between John Adams and Abigail Adams during the American Revolution. And so the letters that would be exchanged amongst families serving in 21st century wars, how can we study that if it was email? Is that something that you think about? Like how could we tell that story 100 years from now?
Well, a number of books have been written, and that probably do a beginning job. It doesn't have the depth, of hundreds, thousands of letters back home from soldiers that are fighting overseas, although they have written letters today still. And unfortunately, I understand the public schools don't even teach writing anymore. They teach keyboarding or printing.
I know we're losing cursive. Would anybody amen that? Some of our teachers. And so I mean, sometimes I wish they would just type it, Bill, because I can't read it anyway.
Yeah.
But it is something. It's kind of an art form. I remember the way my mother's deceased, but her letters, she deserved her own font. She had such beautiful. Did you have family members that have beautiful handwriting. And I'm not going to call out those of you that I can't read your handwriting. We'll just leave you right where you are, Bob Fink. But we kind of have that, and even a worry about or concern about the way we write.
You know, in the question about education, you know, I think that I omitted two very major things. I think that regardless of everything else, that you need to read voraciously. Not only the things that are of interest at the moment, or that your need for your business or your major, but read all sorts of fiction, history, everything. Just read a book all the time.
So what are you reading right now?
Okay. I'm reading, unfortunately I can't remember the author's name, but I just got through with a book written by the guy that's on Fox News, Killing the Rising Sun. And before that, I read the history of Killing Lincoln, and that little series. I haven't read all of them, but they're not in definitive histories, but they give you a really good overview of that situation in that time. And so those are ones that just been involved with. I'm reading I decided to take a course in Western civilization from, what's the name of the college that, anyway, they have it free.
Oh, right.
And they sent a book that's about that thick, you know, and it has selections of Plato and Aristotle and going forward with, you know, and I'm reading that. I read several books at the same time.
Aristotle before bed, just a little Plato.
Well, you know, Plato is not that hard to read, really. An Apology is one of the great stories of all time. And
so you have several books on your nightstand, so to speak, at all times.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So reading is important. And what was the second thing? I cut you off. So
reading and writing.
yeah.
I think that we are a generation that doesn't write. I mean, we communicate electronically, but we just don't write. And I think that in business, you're going to be called to write a lot. And you have to, if you're a doctor, you're writing reports on all your patients. If you're you know, I mean, you just have to be conversant with writing, whether you're writing on a typewriter or a computer or however you're communicating. You need to write. You need to create words that convey what you want to convey. Because communication, you know, is crucial.
So do we have some questions? You guys have something? I love hearing Bill push on you to read and write more. Do you love that? You don't have any papers due now, right? You don't have any readings you need to get done. Thanks. Okay, so are you ready for this?
Yeah.
All right. Is there a photo or a collection that has made a great impact on your life?
Well, one book is, I think, particularly interesting. It deals with the history of photography. Gernsheim, as Roy back there knows quite well,
I noticed he didn't sit in the front row.
No,
so we
he-
could have him come up easily.
That's right. But Helmut Gernsheim wrote a history of photography with his wife. She was also involved. And the neat thing about that is, at the Ransom Center at UT, we have his collection of photographs that he made. And not only do we have his collection of photographs, he used to come to the United States, and I got him to come to Hardin-Simmons. And I don't know if any of our faculty here remember, but he gave a talk on the first photograph and how he discovered it. And that was really a fascinating book, and you all probably have a copy in your library.
Good question and fun answer. Okay, so this is great.
All right.
Tell me about your newest project and how did you go about selecting it? So you have a book coming out in the fall.
Yes. The book is about a frontier woman by the name of Maggie Smith. And she ran the trading post down at Hot Springs in the Big Bend National Park. And she went down there in the early 40s. And the park was just, actually before the park was made or designed, it was still, the state of Texas was still trying to get a national park. And so it tells the story a little bit about how that park came to be, but through her life there, she had this trading post, and it handled the mail too. So she really had a little post office there, and they didn't have roads. I mean, it was horses and wagons. They had wagon type roads. No electricity. And
Very remote area.
very remote area. And basically her trade came from the neighboring ranches and across the river from Mexico. And the thing that is so magical about her is the fact that she was such a humanitarian. She would take the Mexican kids that for some reason didn't have a parent, or their parents had died, and she would raise them. And she would, if a woman lost a child in childbirth, she'd take the baby and nurse it until someone would take it. I mean, she was a one-woman hospital, and she traded stuff. And when the national park came in, that didn't fit their plan. You know, it wasn't a concession type operation. I mean, she kept books in a cash register, you know. I mean, if she had the money, she bought the stuff. If she didn't, she didn't. And she would trade sacks for eggs, you know, so that the women could make clothes. And she also fenced candelilla wax. This was not illegal to import into the United States, but it was not legal to export out of Mexico because Mexico had a lock on it, a monopoly, and it had to go to the bank, and they approved it, and then by the time it had to clear customs and all that. But what she would do is she would buy the semi-refined wax from these native Indians, Mexican workers that were just poor as dirt, you know, and they barely had enough to live on, but they would pull up that plant and they would they would buy some acid and put it in a boiling pot and get the wax, skim it off, and dry it and put it in chunks and in gunny sacks and put it on burros, and then at midnight they'd just cross the river and Maggie would buy it, and then she'd sell it to a refiner in Alpine, and she made money doing that, but she gave it all back to the people, you know, and she was really an amazing woman. And so I thought that she deserved to have a book. No one ever written a book about her, and so that's.
You didn't meet her. You have
I never met her.
Stories about her.
Yeah.
But you did not know her.
That's right, and that brings another point. You know, this is all oral history. Very little written in that situation. So how do you triangulate? You know, how do you know that this story is true? And this story is just a figment of somebody's imagination.
So do you mind telling a story that you left out because you couldn't corroborate the story?
Yeah. One person told me that the Ku Klux Klan had made a foray into the Big Bend, and that she had, and the story wasn't clear about whether they were black children or whether they were Hispanic children or what, but she hid her kids, these young children, under the floor of her store in a little cave sort of thing that was built down there. And because of the Ku Klux Klan, they said that they were going to, you know, but I was unable to document that, and so I left it out. Another problem is that you see maybe 3 stories that are the same occurrence, but told differently, you know. And I mean, there were some awful stories about when a woman would call and across the river. They would go maybe at 10 at night, have to go 10 miles on mules and horses and get to this little place, and they'll come in, and you know, maybe there's a little family around there, and the pregnant woman is strung up from the rafters, you know, with a rope around her stomach to not allow the baby to be, I mean, just horrible stories. And so she would cut them down, deliver them, and sometimes the mother survived and sometimes she didn't. But they would take the kid and bring it back and nurse it, you know, and so I mean, there's some pretty raw stuff in it, but it was, that's the way it was.
Yeah. It's a rough terrain, and it took,
yeah,
and continues to take,
right, and
hardy people.
And so you had, but to your point, it's hard to say that the people said this or the people said that, and so you just have to, but you know that there's enough stories that you get the general condition, you know, and that's real. The general condition is real. The individual story may be warped a little bit one way or another, but you understand that in this kind of a story.
Okay, let's take another question. Would you tell our guests a little bit about your experiences with Humanities Texas?
Well, I was very pleased to be appointed by Governor Wright to the what was it wasn't Humanities Texas then, it was the Texas Committee for the Humanities, and that title changed, but it's the state representation of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and that's how I got on that board. But very interesting thing, we had a publication that we called the Texas Humanist. Got into a lot of trouble with the extreme right-wing, ultra-conservative Baptist movements. They thought it was anti-Christian. But, it certainly wasn't. We were talking about the humanities. And that actually includes the history of religion as one of the major humanity issues. But anyway, we finally changed the name of it. They just beat us down. But the thing that I was really pleased with is that we were able to create enough of a fund to be able to send exhibitions and speakers and different ones. We had the president of Rice come here to give a speech here at Hardin-Simmons, one of our annual events, and it still continues to do really good work. They have a program where they give teachers a stipend to come to a summer workshop in the humanities. It might be Civil War one time, it might be the Constitution one time, it varies. And for all of the teachers that in the Abilene School District, if I was a teacher, I'd be making an application to go to every one of them. But, obviously that's not possible for the state of Texas. We're limited in how many that they can give, but they do great work, and they have traveling exhibitions that Hardin-Simmons could certainly avail themselves of, photographs and all sorts of texts, TEX, TS, and so that I thought my time there was really well spent.
So, what would you consider?
And excuse me,
yeah, go ahead.
there might be you might be interested to know that our museum director, Laura Moore's husband, is on the board now of Humanities Texas.
Good.
Yeah.
So we have another question, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. But for younger people who would like to, start a conversation with older members of their family to try to capture some of that history, do you have any tips for them to gather some of those stories, or to open up?
Sure.
That's in a respectful way, or anything they shouldn't say? Or...
Well, I don't know. I think that depends on maybe the family situation. But I will tell you one thing about that. The way that I went about it is my sister I see sitting back there, we got our mother to, and my aunt, my mother's sister, and we got them together with a video camera, and they got to talking back and forth between them, and we just sat back and listened to all this family history, and it all went on the tape, and it was fun for them, and it didn't seem to be imposition. But another technique that I used is I would just give someone a tape recorder and say, look, sometime when you have time, just lean back in your chair and tell us, especially about World War II veterans. They generally speaking, they didn't want to talk about their issues. and that's true today. But there was a movement to get World War II documented from the people, their experiences and letters and things, and so what I did was I went to all the people that I knew that had served in World War II and took my little recorder and plenty of tape, and I said, look, you just sit down and you just start telling stories. And when you're through with everything you want to say, call me and I'll come pick it up. And then I had it transcribed and send it off to North Texas, that their history department has a military history specialty, and so those are archived there for. And Bob Trotter, my friend, he did it too, and we probably sent 40 or 50 recordings. But one thing that was a real thrill for me, my wife Alice said, you need to need to record the experiences of my friend who I play bridge with, because he's never told anything about his military service. And so I said, sure. And so I took the recorder over there, and he said, fine, you'd do it. And so 3-4 months later, I picked it up, and it was an enormously interesting story. He was a fighter pilot, had crashed his plane during the war in, I believe it was Belgium, and he escaped. I mean, he got out of the plane before it burned, or I don't think it actually burned, but it was a crash landing, and but he had to escape the Nazis, and so he told about escaping the Nazis, getting caught, put in a prison camp. He escaped from there, and it was an enormous story. He'd never told his family. And one time his son was in town. He called me and he said, I'd like to, hear the tape. And I said, sure, I'll give you a copy. And I copied it and gave it to him, and he called me and he said, listen, he said, I had to pull over to the side of the road. He was listening to it on his way back to Austin, and he was a filmmaker. And he said, I want to make a film of this. And so he got his friend, and they made a film of it. And it was picked up by PBS, and it was premiered in Abilene, and it ran on PBS.
That's fantastic.
And I was really pleased.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, does anyone have one or two questions that you didn't write one down, but you would like to ask a question before we kind of visit a little bit and have some book signing?
Well, I'll be around, so if you're too sensitive, you can just come up and we'll talk.
Bill, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's such a joy to visit with you, and thank you all for being here. I hope you've learned a little something and have enjoyed your time with us tonight. And Bill is going to hang around, and he has some of his books over here, and we're going to have him signing some books as well. So we have treats in the back, and the students can get chapel credit and sign for course credit, and Miss Camry Jones will help you with that. But it's been a pleasure to be with y'all tonight. Can we thank Bill for being here?
Thank you. Thank you all for being such a great audience.